I have the letter." The words dropped into the silence of the Duke's study like stones into a deep well. They were flat, devoid of the rage she might have expected. That lack of heat was somehow worse, a cold judgment that seeped into the marrow of her bones. Genevieve Beaumont, Duchess of Blackwood, stood before her husband's immense mahogany desk. The fire in the grate crackled and spat, a lone, lively sound in a room suffocated by velvet draperies and the scent of old leather and his quiet, devastating fury. She had been summoned from her rooms only moments ago, a curt request delivered by a footman whose eyes had refused to meet hers. Now she knew why. Alistair did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the single sheet of cream stationery laid out before him, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the desk. He was a statue of aristocratic displeasure, carved from granite and grief. "I do not understand," she said. Her own voice sounded foreign, a thin, papery thing. "Do you not?" He finally lifted his head. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were not filled with the familiar, distant sorrow she had grown accustomed to. They were hard, opaque. She was not his wife in that moment. She was a stranger, a defendant. "It is quite plain. A declaration of affection, a plan for a rendezvous. It is addressed to you." The world tilted. The pattern on the Aubusson carpet, a swirl of faded roses and vines, seemed to writhe beneath her feet. "Alistair, there must be some mistake. I have received no such letter." "It was found in your sewing basket," he stated, his voice still level, tucked beneath the mending for Arthur's shirt. The mention of his son, of her stepson, was a small, sharp twist of a knife. She had just been mending that shirt an hour ago, her fingers tracing the small tear near the cuff, her mind filled with the boy's bright, infrequent smiles. "Who found it?" she asked, a sliver of defiance piercing the fog of shock. "Beatrice." Of course, Beatrice. The name hung in the air, thick and cloying as the perfume she always wore. Beatrice Finch, the sister of Alistair's first, beloved wife, the sainted Eleanor. Beatrice, who had remained at Blackwood Manor as its true chatelaine, a ghost in mourning clothes who managed the household with an iron grip, her presence a constant, silent rebuke of Genevieve's own. Genevieve had known, from the very first day, that she was an interloper. She had been 35 when she married the Duke of Blackwood, a woman whose family had all but given up on her making a respectable match. She was a solution to a problem. The Duke needed a new duchess, a mother for his 2 young children, and her family needed the prestige of the connection. It was a transaction dressed up in silken vows. She had understood that. She had even accepted it. She had not, however, been prepared for the sheer, suffocating weight of the past that permeated every stone of Blackwood Manor. She was a placeholder in a life that had been defined by another woman. Alistair's grief for Eleanor was a third person in their marriage, a constant, unassailable presence. He was polite to Genevieve, impeccably so. He was also completely, utterly absent. He looked at her but saw only the empty space where his first duchess should have been. Their conversations were hollow exchanges about the weather or estate matters. Their dinners were silent, oppressive affairs, with Beatrice seated at the table like a watchful crow, her dark eyes missing nothing. The children, Clara and Arthur, were polite but distant, coached by their aunt to see Genevieve not as a mother, but as a necessary inconvenience. She had tried. In the lonely year since her wedding, she had truly tried. She remembered one afternoon, a rare burst of sunshine in the bleak northern autumn. She had found 4-year-old Arthur in the gardens, crying softly over a fallen wooden soldier. She had knelt, her grey silk dress whispering against the damp grass, and had carefully reattached the soldier's tiny painted head with a bit of twine from her pocket. The boy had looked up at her, his eyes the same startling grey as his father's, and had offered a watery, wondrous smile. "You fixed him?" "Of course," she had said, her heart aching with a sudden, fierce tenderness. "That is what mothers do. They fix things." The smile had vanished as Beatrice swept into the garden. "Arthur, darling, come away from her. You will trouble her grace." Beatrice had steered the boy away, her hand a firm vise on his small shoulder, leaving Genevieve kneeling on the grass, the warmth of the moment turning to ice in her veins. Beatrice was an expert in these small, cruel assassinations of hope. She undermined Genevieve at every turn, always with a veneer of solicitous concern. "Her Grace is not accustomed to children, Alistair. We must not overwhelm her." Or, "Her Grace has such different ideas about running a household. Of course, Eleanor always preferred—" The sentence would trail off, the implication hanging in the air, sharp and poisonous. Alistair, drowning in his own private ocean of loss, had seen none of it. He saw only Beatrice's devotion to her late sister's memory, her tireless care for his children. He saw loyalty. Genevieve saw a slow-moving garrote tightening around her day by day, and now this, the final, perfect stroke. Beatrice found it, Genevieve repeated, her voice gaining a measure of strength. How convenient. Alistair's jaw tightened. Are you implying my sister-in-law would lie? I am stating that I have never seen that letter before in my life. It is a fabrication. And the sapphire brooch? He countered, his voice dropping lower. The Blackwood sapphire, the one I gave you on our wedding day. Beatrice informs me it is missing from your jewelry box. Nausea churned in her stomach. The brooch. A heavy, ornate piece, a starburst of diamonds around a sapphire the size of a robin's egg. It felt like a stone on her chest whenever she wore it, a symbol of a position she held but did not possess. She had seen it this morning, nestled in its velvet box. It is not missing, she insisted, her mind racing. It is in my rooms. No, he said, the word a flat wall of denial. It is not. Your lady's maid confirms it. The box is empty. He leaned forward, the mask of cold control finally beginning to crack, revealing the raw pain beneath. The letter speaks of a gift, a token of esteem. Tell me, Genevieve, is it so unbelievable that you, trapped in this loveless marriage, might seek comfort elsewhere, that you might pawn a piece of your cage to fund your escape? The cruelty of it stole her breath. He was taking her own silent misery, the despair she had so carefully hidden from him, and twisting it into a motive for a crime she did not commit. He saw her as a trapped animal, yes, but one that would chew off its own leg in a desperate, sordid fashion. He had never truly seen her at all. That is a monstrous thing to say. Is it? He stood, the full force of his height and his fury finally unleashed. He was no longer a statue. He was an avalanche. What am I to believe? I have the word of a woman who has been a sister to me, who has raised my children, who loved my wife. And I have the word of a woman I barely know. A woman who walks through my house like a phantom, whose eyes are always somewhere else. Who do you imagine I will trust? The question was rhetorical. The verdict had already been delivered. She was guilty. She had been found guilty the moment she had failed to be Eleanor. The cold shock that had held her rigid began to recede, replaced by a wave of heat. It was not the blush of shame. It was rage, a pure, righteous anger that burned away the fog of despair. He had judged her without a trial. He had used her own loneliness as a weapon against her. He had allowed that venomous woman to poison him, to poison everything. Then there is nothing more to be said, she said, her voice now as cold and clipped as his had been. You have made your judgment, your grace. I will not stand here and be further insulted. You will stand here until I dismiss you, he thundered, his hand slamming down on the desk. The inkwell jumped. You are my wife. You are the Duchess of Blackwood. And you have brought shame and scandal to my name. I am the woman you have ignored for a year, she shot back, the words tearing from her throat. The Duchess in name only, a convenience you purchase to warm your bed and provide a veneer of stability for your children. Do not speak to me of shame. The shame is yours, Alistair. The shame is in letting your grief curdle into this willful blindness. You wanted a ghost. You cannot be surprised when you find you cannot trust one. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Her raw, unvarnished honesty had struck a chord he had not expected. But it was too little, too late. Beatrice had laid her foundations too well. He drew himself up, the ducal mask sliding back into place. You will be gone by morning. A carriage will be arranged to take you to a convent in the north, a quiet place. You will live out your days there in contemplation of your sins. A convent, a prison of piety to replace the prison of privilege. Her life, decided and discarded in the space of 10 minutes. No, she said. The word was quiet, but it had the density of iron. No? He looked at her as if she had suddenly sprouted a second head. I will not be sent to a convent. I will not be packaged and hidden away like some embarrassing secret. You wish me gone? I will go, but I will go on my own terms. She turned, her back straight, and walked toward the door. Every step was a declaration of war against the life that was trying to erase her. Genevieve, he called after her, his voice a mixture of command, and for the first time, a hint of desperation. She did not stop. She did not look back. She pulled the heavy oak door open and stepped out into the hall. The footman who had summoned her was still there, his face pale. She walked past him, her head held high, the sound of the study door slamming shut behind her echoing like a gunshot. She did not return to her grand ducal chambers. They were not hers. Instead, she went to the small dressing room that connected to them. There, she stripped off the gray silk gown, the symbol of her station, and let it fall in a heap on the floor. From the back of the wardrobe, she pulled out a simple dark wool traveling dress she had arrived in a year ago. It was plain, practical. It was hers. She did not look at the empty jewelry box that lay open on her vanity, a silent, lying witness. She did not need to. She knew Beatrice had taken the brooch. She took nothing else. No jewels, no trinkets. She did, however, open a small hidden drawer in her writing desk. Inside was a leather pouch containing £50, the last of her own money from before her marriage. A pathetic sum for a duchess, a fortune for a fugitive. She tucked it into an inner pocket of her dress. Her final stop was the nursery. The room was quiet, lit only by a single low-burning lamp. Clara, at 7, was a miniature of her mother, Eleanor, with pale blonde hair spread across her pillow. Genevieve's heart ached. She had never been allowed to get close to the girl. She moved to the other small bed. Arthur was curled on his side, his dark hair falling over his forehead. One small hand was clutched around the wooden soldier she had mended for him. A tear slid down her cheek, hot and sudden. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above his hair, wanting so desperately to touch him, to say goodbye. But she could not. It was not her right. She was a ghost, and ghosts leave no trace. She straightened up, wiped the tear from her face with the back of her hand, and walked out of the nursery, out of the manor, and out of the life of Alastair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood. She did not wait for morning. She did not wait for a carriage. She walked down the long, winding drive, the gravel crunching under her sensible shoes, and did not once look back at the grand, cold prison she was leaving behind. The night was cold and moonless, and for the first time in a year she felt the sharp, terrifying thrill of being utterly, completely alone and free. 5 years passed. The woman who called herself Mrs. Finch bore little resemblance to the Duchess of Blackwood. The Duchess had been a creature of silk and shadows, her hands soft, her face pale from a life lived indoors. Mrs. Finch's hands were chapped and strong, perpetually dusted with flour. Her face was weathered by the wind and sun, and fine lines now radiated from the corners of her eyes. They were not lines of sorrow, but of wry observation. At 40, she looked her age, and she did not care. She had found her way to Oakhaven, a small, forgotten village nestled in a chalk valley 200 miles south of Blackwood. It was a place of stone cottages, a babbling river, and the pervasive, comforting smell of baking bread. That smell had led her to Mrs. Gable's bakery. Mrs. Gable was a widow with a sharp tongue and a heart as soft as her sourdough. She had seen the desperation in the newcomer's eyes, asked few questions, and offered her a job and a tiny room above the shop. Genevieve had learned to knead dough until her shoulders screamed. She learned to rise before the sun, to score loaves with a practiced flick of the wrist, to charm the village children with a broken biscuit and a kind word. She shed the Duchess like a snake sheds its skin. The quiet, observant nature that had been a weakness at Blackwood became her strength here. She listened. She learned. She survived. Her old family, the Ainsworths, had completed her exile. A month after her flight, a letter had reached her through a discreet solicitor, delivered to the post office of a town she had passed through. It was from her father. It informed her that, due to the grievous scandal, she was no longer welcome in their family. A small annuity would be paid to her, provided she disappeared completely and never used their name again. She had torn the letter and the check into tiny pieces and thrown them into the river. She would not be bought. Her life was small, but it was her own. She was no longer a ghost. She was a baker, a woman of substance. At Blackwood Manor, Alastair lived in a mausoleum of his own making. The 5 years since Genevieve had walked out had not been kind. The house grew colder, quieter. Beatrice's control became absolute. She was a tyrant of mourning, insisting on a perpetual state of somber remembrance for Eleanor. Laughter was an offense. Bright colors were a sin. The children withered. Clara became a pale, anxious girl, terrified of displeasing her aunt. Arthur, now 9, was sullen and withdrawn. The bright spark Genevieve had once seen in him was gone, buried under layers of grief and discipline. Alastair's own grief for Eleanor had finally, mercifully, faded, but it was not replaced by peace. It was replaced by a hollow, echoing regret. Genevieve's final words to him haunted his waking hours. "You wanted a ghost. You cannot be surprised when you find you cannot trust one." He began to see the truth in them. He began to see Beatrice not as a loyal sister, but as a keeper of his cage. He started to pull at the threads of her story. It began with a chance remark from a stable hand about the horse trader, a man named Riggs, who Beatrice had implied was Genevieve's secret lover. The stable hand mentioned Riggs had been in Ireland buying ponies for a full month during the time he was supposed to have been meeting the Duchess in the woods. Alistair spent a week locked in his study with 5 years of estate ledgers. It was a penance, a methodical search for a truth he was terrified to find. And he found it. A payment to Riggs for 3 Irish ponies, dated. The travel dates confirmed in the man's own sales records, which Alistair's agent in London procured at great expense. The man had not been within 100 miles of Blackwood. The lie was a crack in a dam. Suddenly, he saw everything. Beatrice's constant presence at his side, her subtle poisoning of his mind against Genevieve, her control of the children. He hired a private investigator, a discreet man from London, who discovered that Beatrice had a significant gambling debt, run up through a third party. The sapphire brooch had not been sold to a lover. It had been sold to a jeweler in York to cover her losses. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. It had not just been Genevieve whom Beatrice had deceived, it had been him. She had used his grief as a tool, manipulating him, isolating him, and securing her own position of power within his home. He had not just been a fool, he had been a willing one. He had allowed his sorrow to make him cruel, and he had cast out an innocent woman without a second thought. The guilt was a physical weight. It crushed the air from his lungs. He had to find her. He had to atone, but she had vanished. His investigators found the trail of the disowning letter from her family, but after that, nothing. She had disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed her. His focus shifted to his children. Seeing them through newly opened eyes was agony. He saw their unhappiness, their fear of Beatrice. He needed to save them. And that began with finding a new governess, someone kind, someone who could bring light back into their lives. His solicitor heard of a woman in a remote village, a respectable widow known for her gentle way with children. Her name was Mrs. Finch. The irony of the name was a bitter pill, but he was desperate. He decided to go himself, to assess the woman in person. He would not make the same mistake of trusting another's judgment again. He took Arthur with him, hoping the change of scenery might do the boy some good. And so, the Duke of Blackwood's carriage rolled into the sleepy village of Oakhaven on a bright spring morning. He left the carriage at the inn and walked toward the bakery, his son's small hand tucked into his. The smell of baking bread was warm and wholesome, a scent of life that had been absent from his own home for years. He pushed open the door. A small bell tinkled. The woman behind the counter did not look up immediately. She was sliding a tray of golden brown rolls onto a wooden rack, her movements efficient and sure. She wore a simple blue dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a dusting of white flour on her forearms. "I will be with you in a moment," she said, her voice calm and pleasant. Alistair froze. He knew that voice. It was deeper now, richer, but it was hers. His heart hammered against his ribs. It could not be. Arthur, however, had let go of his father's hand. He had spotted the tray of slightly misshapen biscuits on the counter, the ones for the children. He walked forward, his gaze fixed on them. The woman turned, a smile ready on her lips. The smile died. Her eyes, a warm, intelligent brown he had never forgotten, widened in shock. The color drained from her face. She gripped the edge of the counter, the flour on her hands leaving a white imprint on the dark wood. Genevieve. It was her, but it was not her. The timid, haunted Duchess was gone. In her place was a woman who looked strong, capable, and utterly self-possessed. The years had carved a new person from the wreckage of the old one. "You," she breathed, the word a wisp of disbelief. Alistair could not speak. The sight of her, alive and well but so profoundly changed, was a physical blow. The gulf of his failure, of the 5 years he had stolen from her, stretched between them, a vast and uncrossable canyon. It was Arthur who broke the spell. He pointed a small finger at the broken soldier she had once mended, which he still carried in his pocket. He held it up for her to see. "It is still fixed," he said, his voice small but clear. Genevieve's gaze dropped from Alistair's face to the boy. She saw the child she had last seen asleep in his bed, now a pale, serious boy on the cusp of his 10th birthday. She saw the soldier. The memory of that day in the garden, of that brief, stolen moment of connection, rushed back. Her expression, which had been a mask of shock, hardened into something impenetrable. She looked back at Alistair, and the Duchess was well and truly gone. This was Mrs. Finch, and Mrs. Finch was not afraid of him. "What are you doing here, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice cold enough to frost glass. I I was looking for a governess, he stammered, the words sounding absurd even to his own ears. For my children, I was told of a Mrs. Finch. A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. You have found her, but I am afraid the position is not suitable. My life is here now. Now, if you are not buying bread, I must ask you to leave. You are disturbing my customers. She turned her back on him, a gesture of dismissal so complete it was more powerful than any tirade. He was nothing to her, a ghost from a past she had buried. Genevieve, please, he said, his voice raw. We must talk. There is nothing to talk about, she said, not turning around. You had your say 5 years ago. It was quite definitive. He could not leave. He could not accept this. He saw the life she had built here, a life of honest work and simple dignity, a life she had been forced into because of his blindness, his weakness. I know the truth, he said, his voice low and urgent, about Beatrice, about the brooch, about the letter. I know it was all a lie. She stilled. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, she slowly turned back to face him. The look in her eyes was not one of relief. It was one of profound, weary contempt. You know, she said flatly, how wonderful for you. And it only took you 5 years. 5 years, a team of investigators, and I imagine a great deal of expense. I knew the truth in 5 minutes, and it cost me everything. She looked past him, to Arthur, who was watching them with wide, confused eyes. Her expression softened for a fraction of a second. You should take your son and go, Your Grace. This is no place for you. He could not go. Leaving now would be a second abandonment, a final confirmation of his cowardice. No, he said, the word echoing her own defiance in his study all those years ago. I will not go. He took a step back, out of her space, a gesture of concession. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I know I have not earned it. I have no right to it. But I am asking you to listen. That is all. Genevieve looked at the man before her, the Duke of Blackwood. He looked older. The sorrow in his eyes was no longer for a dead wife. It was for a living one he had destroyed. For the first time, she saw not the arrogant nobleman who had condemned her, but a man drowning in a sea of his own making. She glanced at the bell above the door, half expecting another customer to interrupt this impossible scene. The street outside was quiet. There was only the Duke, his son, and the smell of cooling bread. Fine, she said, the word clipped. You may speak, but not here. She untied her apron, her movements sharp. Mrs. Gable will be back soon. I will walk with you to the river, but the boy stays here. He can have a biscuit. She did not wait for his agreement. She rounded the counter, her eyes avoiding his, and gently guided Arthur to a small stool in the corner, pressing a sweet biscuit into his hand. The boy looked from her to his father, then took the biscuit with a shy nod. The simple, maternal gesture was another twist of the knife in Alistair's heart. It was a glimpse of the mother his children had lost. She led him out of the bakery and down the narrow lane that ran toward the river. The air was fresh with the scent of damp earth and wild garlic. They walked in silence, the space between them humming, with unspoken accusations and years of pain. When they reached the riverbank, a quiet spot shaded by weeping willows, she stopped and turned to him. Well, you wished to speak. Speak. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times. But now, faced with her cold, expectant gaze, the words felt hollow and inadequate. I was a fool, he began, his voice rough. A blind, arrogant fool. I was so lost in my own grief that I could not see anything else. I could not see you. I let Beatrice poison my mind because it was easier than facing the truth. The truth that my life with Eleanor was over, and I was afraid of what came next. He laid it all bare. The investigation, the discovery of Beatrice's debts, her lies. The proof that the horse trader was in Ireland. He spared himself nothing, detailing his own weakness, his own culpability, his inexcusable failure to protect her. She listened without interruption, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. When he finally fell silent, the only sound was the gentle murmur of the river flowing over smooth stones. So, you have uncovered the conspiracy, she said, her tone devoid of emotion. You have unmasked the villain, and now you have come here expecting what? That I will be grateful, that I will weep with relief and fall into your arms, my name finally cleared? No, he said quietly. I expect nothing. I came here to tell you the truth, and to tell you that I have dealt with Beatrice. I have sent her away. She will not trouble you or my children ever again." "You sent her away," Genevieve echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her. "How neat. You cast me out into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on my back, and you send her away. I wonder, did she have a carriage, a comfortable allowance to ease her exile?" The barb hit its mark. He flinched. "I have made sure she will not want for basics, but her life of privilege is over. Her reputation is ruined. I made the truth of her actions known among our circle." "Your circle?" she scoffed. "The same circle that would have shunned me as an adulteress without a second thought? You will forgive me if I do not find comfort in their revised judgment." She took a step closer, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "Do you have any idea what it was like to be 35 years old, a duchess one day and a beggar the next? To have your own family turn their backs on you, to walk for days, sleeping in barns, terrified of every man who looked at you, to learn to scrub floors and bake bread because if you did not, you would starve? Do your neat investigations and tidy resolutions encompass any of that?" "No," he whispered, the word tasting of ash. "I cannot imagine it, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for it." "There is no atonement for what you did," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "You did not just believe a lie, Alistair. You chose to. You looked at me, the woman who shared your name and your bed, and you saw a criminal. You threw me away like garbage. That is not something that can be fixed with an apology." She turned to leave, her back rigid. "I am not leaving Oakhaven," he said, the words stopping her. She turned back, a questioning look on her face. "I have taken rooms at the inn. I will stay here until you believe me." "Believe you?" she asked, incredulous. "I believe you know the truth now. It changes nothing." "It changes everything," he insisted. "I am not that man anymore. That man was a coward. I am asking for a chance to show you who I am now." He stayed. To the astonishment of the entire village, the formidable Duke of Blackwood took up residence in the slightly shabby best room at the Swan's Head Inn. He sent his carriage and the majority of his staff back to Blackwood, keeping only his valet, a stoic man who seemed entirely unfazed by the dramatic downgrade in their circumstances, and he began his penance. It was not a campaign of grand gestures. There were no diamonds, no dramatic declarations in the village square. It was a siege of quiet, relentless service. He learned her schedule, the rhythm of her days. He saw that the bakery's back fence was rotten and sagging. The next morning, he arrived not in his ducal finery, but in a plain shirt and work trousers, carrying new oak posts and a set of tools. He spent the entire day digging post holes and setting a new, sturdy fence. He did not speak to her. He just worked. Genevieve watched him from the bakery window, her heart a confusion of anger and a strange, reluctant warmth. It was absurd. A duke, his hands covered in dirt, mending a baker's fence. It was the most honest work she had ever seen him do. He started visiting the bakery every morning. He did not come to talk to her. He came to buy a loaf of bread, paying with a crisp coin like any other customer. And he came to see Arthur. He would bring his son, and while he stood quietly in the corner, he would let Arthur talk to Genevieve. The boy was the bridge. He was starved for the simple, uncomplicated affection Genevieve offered. She would save him the best biscuit, ask him about his lessons, and listen with genuine interest as he described a beetle he had found. Through Arthur, Alistair began to see the woman he had cast away, the mother his children desperately needed. He saw her patience, her humor, her quiet strength. One afternoon, a cart carrying barrels from the local brewery lost a wheel right outside the bakery. The barrels tumbled into the muddy street, and the drayman cursed, helpless. Before anyone could react, Alistair was out the door of the inn, wading into the mud. He was strong, and with his help the barrels were rolled to the side of the road and the wheel was fixed. He returned to the inn covered in mud, earning a grudging nod of respect from the drayman and a few stunned looks from the villagers. He was not playing at being a commoner. He was simply doing what needed to be done. He was being useful. It was a language Genevieve, who had built her life on usefulness, understood far better than apologies. He brought witnesses. He paid the horse trader, Riggs, a handsome sum to travel to Oakhaven. The man, florid and nervous, stood before Genevieve in the inn's private parlour and swore on a Bible that he had never met her, never spoken to her, and had been in Ireland for the entire month in question. Next came Alistair's solicitor, a dry, precise man who laid out documents on the table. They were bank records and reports from the London jeweller, proving Beatrice's gambling debts and the sale of the sapphire brooch. It was a cold, methodical dismantling of the lie. Genevieve looked at the papers, at the proof of her innocence laid out in black and white. She felt no triumph, only a vast, bone-deep weariness. I did not need these papers, Your Grace. I knew I was innocent. I know, Alistair said, his voice gentle. They are not for you. They are for me. They are the evidence of my crime. I need you to see that I have acknowledged it in full. The walls around her heart, so thick and high, began to show cracks. His humility was disarming. He was not demanding forgiveness. He was simply laying himself at her mercy, day after day. He was courting her, not as a duke courts a duchess, but as a man courts a woman he has wronged and desperately hopes to win back. The turning point came on a cold, rainy night a month after his arrival. A message came from the inn. Arthur was sick. A fever had taken hold, and he was delirious, calling for his father and, to Alistair's despair, for her. Genevieve did not hesitate. She threw her shawl over her shoulders and ran through the rain to the inn. She found Alistair by his son's bedside, his face a mask of fear and helplessness. The village doctor had been and gone, offering little more than advice to keep the boy warm and pray. Arthur was thrashing in the bed, his skin hot to the touch, his words a jumble of nonsense. Genevieve took charge. She sent Alistair for cool water and fresh linens. She bathed the boy's forehead, her touch firm and soothing. She spoke to him in a low, steady voice, murmuring stories and nonsense rhymes. "It is all right, little one," she whispered, her hand stroking his damp hair. "I am here. You are safe." Alistair stood in the doorway and watched. He saw not a duchess, not a baker, but a mother. He saw a fierce, protective love that he himself had failed to provide. He saw everything he had thrown away. The sight broke him. He sank into a chair in the corner of the room, buried his face in his hands, and wept. Not for his lost wife, not for himself, but for his son and for the woman who was saving him. Genevieve worked through the night. She did not rest. She coaxed sips of water between the boy's lips. She held his hand when he cried out. She was an anchor in his feverish storm. Toward dawn, the fever broke. Arthur's breathing evened out, and he fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Exhaustion hit Genevieve like a physical blow. She sagged against the bedpost, her entire body trembling. Alistair was at her side in an instant, his hands on her arms, steadying her. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Genevieve, thank you." She looked up at him. His face was ravaged by fear and sleeplessness. The ducal arrogance was stripped away, leaving only a raw, desperate vulnerability. In that moment, she did not see the man who had condemned her. She saw Arthur's father, a man who loved his child and was terrified of losing him. "He is a good boy," she said softly. "He deserved better than Beatrice." "We all did," he replied, his grip on her arms gentle but firm. "I should have protected you. I should have protected them. I failed everyone." Something inside her finally let go. The anger, the bitterness, the years of carefully guarded pain. It did not vanish, but it receded, making way for something new, a fragile, reluctant empathy. "You were drowning, Alistair," she said, using his name for the first time in 5 years. "And she handed you a stone." He met her gaze, and the chasm between them seemed, for the first time, not so vast. "Will you let me try to build a bridge?" She did not answer with words. She simply nodded, a small, tired gesture that felt more significant than any vow. She returned to Blackwood Manor a week later, not as a returning penitent, but as an equal. They traveled together in his carriage, Arthur sitting between them, happy and healthy. The journey was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, no longer freighted with anger and regret. Blackwood was different. Beatrice was gone, and her oppressive, mournful presence had lifted like a fog. The heavy velvet drapes had been pulled back, and sunlight streamed into the corridors. Clara, no longer under her aunt's thumb, greeted them with a shy curiosity that quickly blossomed into warmth when she saw the change in her brother and her father. Genevieve did not resume her old role as the phantom duchess. She took the reins of the household with the same no-nonsense efficiency she had learned in the bakery. She filled the house with flowers and laughter. She planned meals that were delicious, not just appropriate. She spent her afternoons with the children, reading to them, walking with them in the gardens, mending their clothes and their spirits. Alistair watched her, his heart filled with a love that was deeper and more profound than anything he had ever known. It was not the memory of first love he had clung to for so long. It was a love born of respect, of admiration for her resilience, and of a deep, abiding gratitude. He did not try to rush her. He continued his penance, not with grand gestures, but with the small, daily acts of a partner. He listened to her opinions on estate matters. He sought her counsel. He made sure she knew that her voice, once silenced, was now the most important one in his life. Forgiveness was not a single moment. It was a slow, deliberate rebuilding. It was in the shared smiles over the children's antics. It was in the comfortable silences as they sat by the fire in the evenings, reading. It was in the way he would reach for her hand, his touch a question, not a demand. One evening, months after her return, he came to her in the garden. She was tending a bed of roses, her hands protected by gardening gloves. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the manor. "I never replaced it," he said, his voice quiet. She looked up, a question in her eyes. He opened his hand. On his palm lay the Blackwood sapphire brooch. It was the same one, reclaimed from the jeweler in York. "I do not expect you to wear it," he said. "I know what it represents, but it belongs to you, to do with as you wish. Sell it, throw it in the river. It is yours." She looked at the brooch, the symbol of her humiliation, glinting in the dying light. Then she looked at him. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the complete surrender of his old pride. She took off her glove, her hand no longer the soft hand of a duchess, but the capable hand of a woman who had survived. She picked up the brooch, its weight familiar in her palm. "It is heavy," she said. "Then let me help you carry it," he replied. A real smile, the first she had truly given him, lit up her face. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I think I will put it away in a drawer, a reminder that some things, however valuable, are not worth wearing." She closed her hand around it, then reached out and took his. "But I will accept your help in the garden. These roses are proving quite stubborn." He laced his fingers through hers, his heart soaring. It was not a grand resolution. It was something far better. It was a beginning. A quiet domestic scene that stood in stark defiance of the cold, oppressive silence that had once defined their lives. They stood together in the fading light, two survivors, a duke and a baker, ready to build a new life not on the ashes of the old, but on a fresh foundation of earned trust, mutual respect, and a love that was all the stronger for having been broken and remade.